Hey everyone, ready to dive into a delicious deep dive today. We're talking all about the science behind cooking amazing food. And not to worry, you don't need a lab coat for this one.
That's right. We're breaking down the hows and whys behind those mouth-watering meals, all thanks to The Science of Good Cooking by America's Test Kitchen.
This book is seriously a game changer. Juicy roasts, we gotcha. Flavorful sears, absolutely. Meat so tender it melts in your mouth. Oh, you better believe we're getting into that.
It's amazing what a little science can do for your cooking.
It really is. Okay, so let's jump right into it with something that seems a little counterintuitive, at least at first. We're talking about the power of gentle heat. You might think blasting your meat over high heat is the way to go, but our friends at America's Test Kitchen might just change your mind.
It's all about moisture. Think about what makes a roast dry and tough.
Lack of moisture is the enemy of deliciousness.
Exactly. And a lot of times, high heat is to blame. Picture this. A beautiful piece of meat hits a scorching hot pan. What happens? All that moisture on the surface, it just evaporates. Poof. Gone.
Leaving you with a sad, dry result instead of a culinary masterpiece.
You got it. Now, there's a really cool example in the book using prime rib. Turns out when you cook it low and slow at 250 degrees, it holds onto a lot more of its moisture, only losing about 9%. But crank up the heat to 450.
Oh no, that doesn't sound good.
It's not pretty. That moisture loss, it more than doubles, almost 25%.
Wow, that's a huge GE difference.
Yeah.
So just by lowering the cooking temperature, we can seriously up the juiciness factor.
Absolutely. And this isn't just about prime rib. It works for all sorts of things. Think about baking a cake. A low and slow oven prevents those dreaded cracks. Same idea here. Slow and steady cooking lets that heat gently make its way through the meat, less moisture loss, and you end up with something tender and delicious.
Okay, that makes sense. But
Yeah.
I'm already sensing a but coming on here. Low and slow is great for juiciness, but don't we need that high heat for flavor? That beautiful browning, those savory notes.
You're talking about the Maillard reaction. It's where those amino acids and sugars in the food react at higher temperatures, creating those deep, complex flavors.
The Maillard reaction, that sounds almost mystical, like some kind of culinary alchemy.
It might sound fancy, but it's pure science. And trust me, you want this happening in your cooking. Picture this. Temperatures above 300 degrees Fahrenheit, things start getting really interesting. We're talking hundreds of flavor compounds coming alive, creating that irresistible aroma and taste that just makes your mouth water.
So are we talking about the difference between a bland boiled chicken breast and a perfectly seared, flavorful steak?
You got it. That gorgeous brown crust you see on your food. That, my friend, is the Maillard reaction in action.
Okay, so it's like a visual cue that deliciousness awaits. But here's the thing. We need high heat for that Maillard magic, but we want to keep things low and slow for juiciness. So how do we do both?
That, my friend, is where the beauty of two-stage cooking comes in. We can have our cake and eat it too. Amazing flavor, A&D, perfect texture.
Two-stage cooking. Tell me more. How does that work?
Let's say you've got a beautiful steak ready to cook. Instead of slapping it right on a scorching hot pan, you're going to start it off gently in a low oven. Let that heat work its way through nice and evenly. This way, you get a perfectly cooked center, no more overcooked outside and raw middle. And then you finish it off with a quick sear over high heat. That's how you develop that gorgeous crust and unleash the full power of the Maillard reaction.
So we're talking about a perfect sear on the outside, but juicy and cooked just right all the way through. That's the dream, right?
Exactly. No more guessing games when it comes to steak. Two-stage cooking gives you that control over how it's cooked. A&D, how much flavor you get. You're basically a culinary scientist at that point.
All right, I got to ask about resting meat because getting the most out of my cooking, especially when it comes to juiciness, is like my thing. We've covered gentle heat, we've talked two-stage cooking, but is resting really that important, or can I just pour myself a glass of wine and call it a day?
Well, I'm never one to say no to a glass of wine while cooking, but resting your meat, definitely not something you want to skip. It's like giving those muscle fibers a little break, letting them relax after all that heat.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What's going on inside that resting meat?
So think about it. When the heat hits the meat, those muscle fibers, they tense up and squeeze out moisture. That's why you often get that pool of juice on your cutting board.
And nobody wants to lose a single drop of that flavorful juice.
Exactly. Resting gives those fibers time to chill out, literally. They relax and reabsorb some of that moisture they lost. And that means
A more tender and juicy piece of meat.
you got it.
So how long are we talking? Is it the same for a steak as it is for, say, a whole roast chicken?
That's a great question. Resting time isn't one size fits all. It depends, how big the cut of meat is. A good rule of thumb is to give those steaks and chops about 5 to 10 minutes. Roasts. Those need more like 15 to 30 minutes, and if you're doing a whole chicken or turkey, at least 15, 20 minutes of resting time.
That makes me think about carryover cooking. We touched on it earlier, but can you remind us what's happening after we take something off the heat?
Carryover cooking, a lot of people forget about it, but it's super important. Basically, the food doesn't stop cooking the second you take it off the heat. That residual heat, it's still doing its thing.
Because the outer part of the food is hotter than the center, so the heat keeps moving inward, right?
You got it. Let's say you're aiming for a medium rare roast. You pull it out of the oven when it hits 135 degrees on the inside, right? But that temperature is going to keep going up another 5 to 10 degrees as the heat evens out.
So we need to factor that in and not overcook it right off the bat.
Exactly. It's way easier to add a bit more heat than try to undo overcooking.
All right, now let's talk tough cuts of meat. What's the secret to turning something that could be chewy into something tender and delicious?
Low and slow cooking, my friend. That's the key. It's all about activating those natural enzymes that break down the tough stuff.
Enzymes? That sounds kind of complicated. Break it down for me. What are they doing to the meat?
Think of enzymes like little helpers inside the meat, speeding up chemical reactions. We're interested in these guys called cathepsins. Their job is to break down collagen.
Collagen, that's what makes meat tough, right?
Bingo. It's a protein in connective tissue. Gives meat its structure. Now, when we cook low and slow, those cathepsin enzymes get to work, breaking down that collagen and turning it into something amazing. Gelatin.
And gelatin is?
What gives you that melt-in-your-mouth texture? You know those amazing stews and braises that are fall-apart tender? That's the gelatin working its magic.
So we're not adding anything extra. The enzymes are already in the meat. We're just creating the perfect environment for them to do their thing.
Exactly. Control the temperature, control the time, and bam, you've unlocked the secret to tender meat.
Love it. Now, what's the magic temperature range for these meat tenderizing enzymes?
A delicate dance, got to stay between 120 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Too low, the enzymes don't really wake up and do their job. Too high, and they fizzle out.
This makes me think about recipes where you brown the meat before slow cooking it. Are we messing with the enzymes by hitting it with that high heat first?
Great point. It's important to remember that different cuts of meat have different needs. If you're working with something like a chuck roast or pork shoulder, browning it first is all about building flavor, that Maillard reaction we talked about, that long, slow cook time afterwards. It'll take care of any toughening that happened during the searing.
So we've got low and slow cooking, enzymes breaking down collagen. It all leads up to braising, right? The ultimate way to make those tougher cuts of meat insanely tender and packed with flavor.
You could say that. Braising, it brings together all these cool scientific principles we've been talking about. You're gently cooking the food in a little bit of liquid, covered up, creating this steamy, moist environment that's like a spa day for tough cuts of meat.
I don't know why, but braising always feels like such a culinary accomplishment. Like you're taking a potentially tough cut of meat and turning it into something truly special.
I completely agree. It really shows how understanding a little science can transform your cooking.
Speaking of science, let's talk about salt for a minute. I think a lot of people just think of it as making things taste salty, but there's so much more to it.
You're preaching to the choir. Salt is like a secret weapon in the kitchen. It can do wonders for both flavor and texture.
Okay, tell me more. What are some of salt's hidden talents besides, well, making things salty?
Well, for one thing, salt can actually dissolve certain proteins in meat. Sounds technical, but what it means is juicier meat. When those muscle fibers hold on to more moisture, you get a much better eating experience.
So when a recipe says to salt your meat ahead of time, it's not just about seasoning, it's a strategic move.
Exactly. That's dry brining. Works wonders, especially on leaner meats that tend to dry out.
What about poultry? Salt's crucial for that crispy skin we all love, right?
For sure. Here's the thing. When you salt poultry skin, it draws out moisture. Then as it cooks, that moisture evaporates, leaving you with crispy, golden brown skin.
Makes sense. But hold on, if we're salting poultry ahead of time for juiciness, aren't we messing with the crispiness?
Good catch. You'd think so, right? But there's a trick. Add a pinch of baking powder to your salt rub.
Baking powder. Now that's interesting.
Baking powder is alkaline, so when it heats up, it changes the pH of the poultry skin. This helps it lose even more moisture, creating those perfect conditions for maximum browning and crispy deliciousness.
Wow. So we're using salt's moisture-wicking powers to get both juicy meat and crispy skin. It's like a win-win.
You got it. It's all about knowing how different ingredients work together and using that to your advantage in the kitchen.
Okay, before I move on, one more salt tip time. It's the secret ingredient a lot of people forget about.
You said it. With salt, giving it time to work its magic makes all the difference. It's not just about how much salt you use, but how long you let it do its thing.
So even a little salt can have a big impact if you give it enough time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's say you're dry brining a chicken. Give it a full 24 hours instead of just 30 minutes before cooking. You'll see a huge difference. The longer the salt has to penetrate the meat, the more evenly seasoned and juicy it'll be.
I had no idea there was so much to know about salt.
It's just one example of how understand the science behind what you're doing in the kitchen can completely change your cooking game.
All right, before we wrap things up, I want to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. Grinding meat at home. I know it seems like an extra step, but trust me, it makes a world of difference, especially when it comes to burgers.
You're speaking my language. Grinding your own meat, it gives you ultimate control. You choose the cuts, how much fat you want, how coarse or fine the grind is. And let me tell you, the flavor. Forget about those store-bought patties.
You know, I always wondered why restaurant burgers always taste so much better. I bet it's because they're grinding their own meat.
You're onto something. Restaurants know that freshly ground, high-quality meat is the key.
Okay, so break it down for us. What are the essentials for grinding meat at home?
First things first, choose the right cuts of meat. You want something with a decent amount of fat, like chuck or sirloin. Fat is flavor when it comes to burgers. Don't be afraid to get friendly with your butcher and ask for a custom blend.
And I'm guessing freshness is key.
Absolutely. Grind it right before cooking if you can, but if you need to do it ahead of time, store it in the coldest part of your fridge for no more than 24 hours.
Got it. What about the actual grinding process? Any tips for getting that perfect texture?
A meat grinder is a lifesaver, but no worries if you don't have one. A food processor can do the trick too. Just cut the meat into smaller chunks and pulse it. Don't let it run continuously.
Don't want to overprocess.
Exactly. Overprocessing equals mushy burgers, and nobody wants that. You're going for a coarser grind. Think of those amazing burger patties that are loosely packed, juicy, and full of flavor.
Okay, so we've got our freshly ground meat. It's perfectly textured. Last words of advice to take our homemade burgers over the top.
Keep it simple. Season generously with salt and pepper, shape those patties, and cook them over medium-high heat. And whatever you do, don't press down on them while they're cooking. You'll just squeeze out all those amazing juices.
Now let's circle back to braising. What is it about this technique that makes it so special?
Think of it like this. Braising is a long, slow hug for your food. You're gently coaxing out all those amazing flavors and breaking down tough cuts of meat until they're melt in your mouth tender. You end up with succulent meat in a rich, flavorful sauce. What's not to love?
It's the kind of food that just makes you feel good.
Exactly. And here's the best part. Braising is pretty hands-off.
Yeah.
You brown your meat, add your liquids, and let it simmer away on the stovetop or in the oven. Your kitchen will smell amazing.
And since we're usually using those tougher, more affordable cuts of meat, it's a budget-friendly way to make an incredible meal.
Exactly. So if you want a surefire way to make tough meat tender and create a depth of flavor that will impress, look no further than braising.
You know, we've covered a lot today, from gentle heat to enzymes, the magic of salt, and now braising. But before we move on, I want to leave our listeners with a thought. We've talked a lot about meat, but all these cooking principles, they don't just apply to protein.
It's a great point. It's easy to just think of vegetables as side dishes, but honestly, they deserve just as much attention as any protein.
So how can we use what we've learned today to up our vegetable game?
Remember the Maillard reaction? Well, guess what? It's not just for meat. Roasting veggies at higher temperatures can bring out so much flavor. You get that natural sweetness and a complexity that you just don't get from other cooking methods.
So crank up the heat and don't be afraid of a little char.
Exactly. And just like with meat, salt is your friend. Salt those veggies before roasting to dry out excess moisture, and you get more intense flavor A&D, that gorgeous caramelization.
Talk about unlocking hidden depths of flavor.
Exactly. Oh, and here's a fun fact. Did you know that how you cook vegetables can actually affect how nutritious they are?
Now that's interesting. Tell me more.
Well, some vitamins and minerals, they dissolve in water, right?
Right.
So when you cook veggies in a lot of water, like boiling, some of those nutrients can escape into the cooking water.
So what's the best way to cook them and hold on to all those nutrients?
Steaming and microwaving are great options because you use less water and cook the veggies quicker so there's less nutrient loss. And of course, eating your veggies raw is always a fantastic choice.
This deep dive has been incredible. It's amazing how understanding a little science can completely transform our cooking.
It really is. Knowledge is power, especially in the kitchen.
We've talked gentle heat, enzymes, the magic of salt, braising.
Oh, and don't forget grinding your own meat. Game changer.
Totally agree. But before we wrap up, there's one last thing. We focused a lot on meat today, but remember those cooking principles we've been talking about? They don't just apply to protein.
So true. Vegetables, grains, even desserts.
Yeah.
Understanding the science behind it all can make anything you cook taste even better.
It's like having a secret code to unlock amazing flavors in everything you cook.
Exactly. The more you experiment and use those principles, the more you'll find your own way of cooking what really works for you.
That's the best part of cooking, isn't it? You never stop learning. There's always something new to discover.
And most importantly, have fun with it. Don't be scared to make mistakes, try something different, and trust your gut.
That's a wrap on today's deep dive into the science of good cooking. We've learned how to make juicier meats, more flavorful veggies, and most importantly, we've gained the confidence to really take our cooking to the next level. So go on, get in that kitchen and make something amazing.
Bon appétit.